What's up, everyone? Welcome back to the Film Jump with Jesse and Chris. We're going to be talking about the Monsterverse, starting with Godzilla 2014. This is a very important movie, especially for Godzilla fans. It's a very important movie, the one that kicked off the Monsterverse as we know it today. So let's jump right into it. Being a Godzilla fan in general, you and I are both on the same page. Absolutely love Godzilla. Grew up watching every movie, own every movie. We are the market for Godzilla movies. So it's hard to find one that we don't like.
Yeah, we're the target audience. We're like you said, we're in the market for this. We're predisposed to like these. Even the worst Godzilla movie we tend to like. So you're getting a pretty, we're coming from a certain side of the aisle on this video.
Mm-hmm. I want to start off with being a Godzilla fan from a very young age. We liked all the old Toho Godzilla movies, all the way up till we had the very last one before what we called the Dark Ages, Godzilla Final Wars in 2004.
Yeah, the 50th anniversary movie that kind of was meant to be a sort of ending point, a long-term hiatus kind of point. You know, it has since come out that a lot of the producers and what have you at Toho were kind of resigned to a point where maybe Godzilla was potentially never going to be brought back by them. You know, and it was sort of fading out of the public consciousness. They were potentially, I doubt that they would have never brought it back, but they didn't have any immediate plans. It's a long story about how this film came into production, but long story short, Legendary got a license to make a American Hollywood Godzilla movie, and that sort of brought Godzilla back into the public consciousness in Japan, but also put Godzilla on a world stage and turned it into a global brand for the modern audience, which is very important for the legacy of the character.
For sure. And I remember a lot of people were nervous back then after what happened with Godzilla 1998. Which, again, as a creature feature, I love that movie now.
Yeah.
And I don't care what anybody says. It's a fun ride.
Very good 90s monster movie. Yeah. Just not a little bit of an odd duckling when it comes to Godzilla movies.
Yeah, it's fun. It's a good time. And it's a good experience. So the marketing starts happening because, they announced Gareth Edwards is directing. He had directed Monsters, which is his directorial debut. A very guerrilla-style, low-budget film. And they announced that we get Bryan Cranston and Aaron Taylor Johnson and
Elizabeth Olsen.
Yep, Elizabeth Olsen and
Ken Watanabe.
Yes,
Watanabe.
The always prestigious Ken. And I remember clear as day the trailer dropping for this movie, and I think it took everybody by storm on the tone and how incredible it looked.
Yeah, it felt very sort of, at the time, the big thing to say was that it feels very Dark Knight-esque. It feels very Nolan-esque, like a Batman Begins style, dark and gritty reboot. It felt like that kind of approach to a Godzilla movie. Like, this is Godzilla that's serious.
And I remember the monologue that David Strathairn was giving as the Admiral over the trailer.
Gentlemen, you are being sent in via Halo Jump. Now, I realize not all of you have had hands-on experience. And frankly, none of us have ever faced a situation quite like this one before. But I would not be asking any one of you to take this leap if I did not have complete faith in your ability to succeed.
Yes.
And then it showed the Halo jump. And I was ready. So ready. I think everyone was ready. And fast forward, we get to see it in IMAX. And it felt like a fever dream after coming off of a 10-year hiatus of Godzilla movies as diehard Godzilla fans. Mm-hmm. We are finally here.
Yeah, technically the longest hiatus the franchise had ever taken. Not about, if you're going to whittle it down, 9.5 years, which is the longest there had ever been, really, between any projects. It just felt kind of surreal. It was a packed IMAX theater opening night. It was just this kind of like, oh, Godzilla's going mainstream now. Like, Godzilla's cool again, a lot of fans were in that headspace too, where it was Godzilla was becoming a bit passé, a bit of the past. Like, you're just gonna let this whole thing go, like maybe cartoons you watched when you were a kid. But it's like, no, now it's back. It's bigger and better than ever for the 60th anniversary of the original film, and it was just it was just an overwhelming experience as a lifelong Godzilla fan.
And it's now the 10-year anniversary of Godzilla 2014. I remember being in the IMAX theater with you and a couple of our other friends and my wife and my family, and it was just a 10 out of 10 experience at that time, right?
Yes.
We always talk about how we rate certain movies, or not certain movies, but all movies, how it's an experience. Did it deliver what it intended to deliver? Did it make me feel a certain way? And how effective was that delivery? And
timing is everything, and there's what a movie needs to be at that place and point in time when it's released, and then how it measures and stands up to the test of time. In that moment, it was exactly the Godzilla movie it needs to be. It's not a perfect movie. And over time, there are things you can look back, especially as we get more Monsterverse movies, there's things to compare and contrast about pros and cons, but at that moment, it was more or less exactly the movie it needed to be.
The scene in Hawaii when he first shows up. And then we get our first hint of what I think a lot of people don't like about it, is that cinematic foreplay that Gareth Edwards talked about, and how he immediately cuts away and then shows a little bit on TV, and then we go to the aftermath.
Yeah.
And he explained how, I find it very interesting showing the destruction, what happened after the fact and whatever. It works and it's acceptable for the first time.
Yeah.
And then we go through it and it happens again. It's kind of like, okay, that's enough now. And I think that's one of the biggest complaints about this movie is the Godzilla screen time.
Yeah, he's Gareth Edwards is a bit of a master at the build up. If you're deep into the third act of a movie and you're still doing the slow grand reveal of the monster for the second or third time, even that slow grand reveal is starting to lose a little bit of its prestige, because you're not meant to have 3 slowly reveal your hero creature moments or 4 slowly reveal your hero creature moments throughout a film. You can't. If the slow big reveal is all, you can't just keep playing that trick over and over.
But there's no denying that when that blue glow first shines on Aaron Taylor Johnson's character and it builds up and he finally does the atomic breath, and to see that on the big screen done the American way, it was absolutely jaw-dropping.
It was fantastic, because I don't think anyone would have had a doubt in our minds going before the film if he would have the breath or not. They kind of seem to want to confirm all of the typical tropes early on. They're like, this is going to be a true Godzilla movie, but you do get so wrapped up in the film and you're not really thinking about it. There's a moment earlier in the fight where it looks like Godzilla's maybe leaning back to do it, but you're so caught up in the moment you're not thinking about it. So then when you just see the blue glow on Aaron Taylor Johnson's face and it travels up the tail, it was this great moment where different people in the audience were realizing it at different times. It was like this wave washing over everyone, where some people, as soon as they saw the light, were like, oh, and then as it goes, you just got this, oh, and then it happened, and it was like the crowd kind of went nuts. It was like it was a beautiful moment.
And then it happens again for the famous kiss of death, when Godzilla defeats the female Muto at the end there, and he gives that epic triumphant roar. The highs in this movie hit really high, especially for a Godzilla fan. I think if you're not a Godzilla fan, maybe you're just a creature feature guy or a fan of these types of films, then I still think it hits pretty high.
It might tease you a bit too much.
Yeah.
There might not be as much Bryan Cranston as you want. The film certainly wouldn't have been hurt if Cranston had been made more of a centerpiece of the movie, or maybe made it through half or 2/3 of the movie as opposed to about a third. That certainly wouldn't have hurt. Cranston chewing it up a little bit with this, it's never a bad thing to have in your movie, giving him a monologue or two. And a lot of people really just wanted Heisenberg versus Godzilla.
Yeah.
I am the one who knocks.
Yeah.
They wanted that movie. They wanted Cranston as a main scientist kind of solving the Godzilla problem. And that's just not really the movie that it is.
I would say that this is still probably kind of, and just barely so, my favorite Godzilla movie of the Monsterverse movies. That being said, I don't rewatch it as much because it is a slow burn. I'll put on the other entries far more often, but it's still kind of, because of that experience, it's like it was such a groundbreaking and monumental experience for me as a Godzilla fan that it still is there, and it brings me back.
Yeah.
I just don't rewatch it as much.
Yeah, I think you can argue that it's sort of the most like fundamentally sound kind of film. But for me, like, I don't have any qualms about saying I prefer King of the Monsters and Godzilla vs. Kong over this movie. And again, there's things this movie does better than those movies. But if you're talking about rating the overall film and experience of kind of expectations and what you want delivered out of it, I'd put this under King of the Monsters and Godzilla vs. Kong.
Yeah, well, and one of my criteria for like my favorite movies of all time, and I'm not talking about like objectively the greatest movies of all time, but subjectively my favorites are how rewatchable is it? You know, when I put it on, do I feel somewhat the same way I did the first time I watched it? And this movie suffers in that regard.
Yeah.
However, and you have to remember, they came up with all of this from the ground up. The look of Godzilla, the sound design,
Yeah.
his now famous Monsterverse roar.
Yeah,
and they've only had to make iterations on that design.
Yeah.
And I'm not taking away from any of the people who made the following
No,
entries, but
as the first film and the introduction, it has to do the Batman Begins laying the groundwork, and it has to shoulder a lot of legwork in terms of setting up the franchise and reestablishing the character in a way that doesn't feel hokey and cheesy. And then from that grounded introduction, you can then stretch and pull the genre and the tropes and the style in different ways with future sequels. But this one needed to fulfill a lot of things in a very specific kind of way, and it does that.
yeah. I want to talk about the actors. A lot of people criticize Aaron Taylor Johnson as being very flat, wooden. I will defend him just a little bit in saying that I think playing a soldier like that who's very duty driven and has to get things done and doesn't ask questions about things, I think he plays it just fine. In the beginning, he shows more emotions, and as the movie becomes him globe-trotting, so to speak, and trying to get back to his family, yeah, he doesn't really emote, doesn't show a whole lot of dramatic range. But that's okay in my opinion, because he's just really the vehicle in which the audience follows along with the action and the set pieces. In that regard, I think him being wooden and being the soldier is acceptable for me.
Yeah, I think they were going for stoic and reserved, and sometimes that can kind of be hard to play, and it can come across as a little wooden, a little stilted, a little underplayed. And I think Aaron Taylor Johnson's also someone that we've talked about this before.
Yeah, we say this a lot.
I think he loses his charisma a little bit when he's got to do the American accent. A lot of Brits do a lot of really good American accents, but Keira Knightley's another one. When she's doing an American accent, just doesn't seem to have the same kind of charm. I think he suffers a little bit from that. There are reports and things like that on the internet that Joseph Gordon-Levitt is who they were eyeing, and that he opted to do Sin City 2 instead. I think Joseph Gordon-Levitt in this role would have been kind of perfect. I feel like I could just see the scenes, such as the blue light flashing on his face, you know, some of these kind of moments. I could just see Joseph Gordon-Levitt bringing that kind of natural charm that he has to it in a way that would have worked and carried without really changing anything else about the film.
Yeah.
So it's not bad casting, but maybe it just a little bit of a misalignment. Apparently they called the character Ford because they were thinking of evoking a bit of a Harrison Ford energy from him, and I can't say that the character we have on screen feels very Harrison Ford-esque. It doesn't have that kind of charm and bravado that you see in a Harrison Ford indie,
definitely doesn't have that charisma.
Yeah, so if that's really truly what they were going for, I don't think they quite hit that.
The movie does lack a little bit of that levity that I think comes with the Harrison Ford charm. And I think fundamentally the story probably should have been a father-son story. The movie sets up the Bryan Cranston, Aaron Taylor Johnson relationship. And even in the beginning, he has to go to Japan to go get him out of jail for trespassing into the quarantine zone again. And I think a better film, in my opinion, would have been one where he survives. And then it's about them going on this journey together. Because when they're together, and Bryan Cranston is talking about how it's his fault that his wife died, and he sent her down there, and Aaron Taylor Johnson's like, I don't want to hear this, and he begins to cry. He does show a little bit of dramatic range there. And I think
absolutely.
they could have carried that together rather than turning this into well, let me defeat these monsters and send this bomb somewhere, but also use that to get back to my family.
Yeah, the movie as it is sort of a Cranston kind of fails to save his family in the early part of the movie, and then Aaron Taylor Johnson,
it becomes his motivation.
Ford kind of keeps his family and is motivated to save his own family, when it feels like it would have worked just as well, maybe more so, if it becomes a man fails to save his wife at the beginning, and then maybe in the climax he succeeds at saving his son. Maybe they could have worked in a scenario where Cranston has to go in, and he's the only one willing to go in to try and get his son out of the city to help his son, in a dire situation. And also, it's kind of a shame that we have Ken Watanabe in this film and Bryan Cranston in this film, and they don't really get to share a lot of meaty dialogue scenes together. The big scene where Serizawa is introducing Godzilla and talking about the history and these creatures and everything, I feel like the movie's just begging for Cranston to be at that table and for them to just be exchanging what they're talking about, instead of Aaron Taylor Johnson's character like remembering what his dad was talking about echolocation and things like that.
Yeah.
I know you don't want to sideline your hero, but they made a choice on how they were going to juggle and maneuver that, and I just think that maybe it's a bit of a miscalculation, and it's certainly a curveball. You don't expect Bryan Cranston to exit the film after the third act, so it definitely first act, but it definitely leaves an impact, and it does throw you for a bit of the loop, and it's some audiences that works for it, and maybe other audiences that kind of pulls them out of the movie. So it's just a bit of a tit for tat situation. I want to point out some of among the things the film does really, really well. Godzilla's first introduction, where it sort of starts at his feet and pans up to his face. That is pulled almost verbatim out of The Return of Godzilla from 1984. So it's a great callback to another great introduction of Godzilla from a prior movie. So I love it when these films do things like that. So I had to point that out.
Well, and you also look at like the language of cinema and camera movements, and it's a hero's introduction.
Yes, you start at the feet and go up.
Feet up.
Yep.
You see that in any movie that
Indiana Jones famously,
Yeah. So let's talk about the really good stuff. I know we kind of touched on it, but I think I can't say enough about how much of an amazing job they did with Godzilla's design.
Yep.
And how they found inspiration through a bear, an eagle, and all this certain stuff, and finally the silhouette just clicked. And the Mutos are also great. The sound design of this movie is just incredible. Yeah. And also the visual effects. Yeah. The visual effects are superb for a 10-year-old movie.
Yeah.
And I get into this a lot. Chris will make fun of me sometimes, but I get into like the technicalities of like VFX.
Say specular highlights.
Yep. Okay. I'm going to. And one of the things this movie does right is when the light hits them, you can see there are specular highlights off of Godzilla's skin, if you will.
And the shell of the Mutos, or the sort of exoskeleton of the Mutos.
Yeah, and the CGI is very good. And when you compare that to some of the scenes, and not all of them, of like King of the Monsters specifically, the weather effects kind of muddy that, and you get very little of those specular highlights. And now that I pointed out, and you go back and watch it, you'll see when the light does show the specular highlights in that movie, the CGI looks so much better for it.
Yeah. On what you said, technically speaking, the monster designs, the monster effects, the sound design, all very good. I don't love the musical score of this film.
Yeah.
I would have really fought hard to get the original Godzilla themes in the movie, or if the original score we got was just a little bit more iconic in and of itself, that would have been, but the score is a little bit soft for me. The main theme, the main title theme isn't bad. It's not bad. It's not Akira Ifukube, but it's not bad. But everything else is kind of very not really memorable. The track they used for the Halo jump is an insert song. It is not an original piece of score music for the film. So that's kind of the most memorable piece of music from the film, and it's not an original.
Which I have to say, I love that they included that in the trailer and then in the movie as well. I love it when movies do that. Big props there.
Absolutely.
Real quick, I kind of want to touch on like Gareth Edwards as a director. I believe that he also likes to shoot a lot of his movies as well. He's actually like operates the camera, and his instincts to kind of only film where a camera would be and not do these crazy unrealistic camera movements really solidified the grounded, gritty feel and the scale. You look at something like this and you compare it to, let's say, Godzilla versus Kong.
Yeah.
Now, there are some good scale shots in there and whatever, but it kind of, they are so on opposite ends of the spectrum as far as grounded reality.
Yeah.
And not to say one is better than the other.
Yeah,
it's a subjective thing.
And there's an argument to be made for both. There is a merit in keeping that sort of, well, where would a camera be in this scenario? That's also limiting in a lot of ways. So if you're trying to be sort of dynamic and unique and change your perspective of, we're not playing on the scale of the humans, we're playing on the scale of the Titans, this is from their perspective, there's an artistic justification to do it differently. It's not one is right and one is wrong. They're two different takes. They each have their pros and cons. If you're putting a camera where, in theory, a camera couldn't really go, that's breaking a certain level of reality. But again, it's very limiting if you're trying to show, this is a Titan film from the Titan perspective, and you're trying to show things on their level. Well, you have to imagine how you would film that. You can't keep everything at the grounded human level, but a film like this doing it certainly gives it a certain grittiness that works.
Yeah. Touching on Gareth Edwards and him with the camera, especially early on in this movie when Cranston is still around and they go back to the quarantined area, there are some camera movements that are almost, dare I say, like Spielbergian.
He's great at reveals. He's great at
the movement of the camera
at the long pan. I'll be the first one to criticize that. I think I'll say that this movie's loaded with a ton of long slow pans, and that some of them don't need to be there. But when he pulls them off, they work really well. When he'll reveal a reflection of a helicopter in a rearview mirror as the camera is on Cranston and his son, just really well composed shots like that. Like when he gets it right, it really works. Other times you're like, all right, does this pan need to be 15 seconds long? Can we get to the point of the shot a little bit quicker? Not everything has to be a slow reveal, but when it's on, it's on. And
yeah,
it really
one that
works.
stands out to me is when the soldiers are walking down by the riverbank and they're searching for any breakage in the bridge.
Yeah.
And then you see the light glow, and then the tank kind of bounces up on the river there.
Hits the shore,
and then you see all the fiery military vehicles flowing down the river. That, again, to me, I was like, man, what a reveal. It almost felt like a War of the Worlds, like Spielberg's War of the Worlds type of shot.
Yeah, very much, very much.
I thought he did well with that. As I look back on Godzilla 2014, you and I both say that you can take any movie and you shake it in 10 minutes, will fall out.
Yep.
And I think this movie in particular would benefit immensely from being shorter by 10 minutes or so.
Yeah, I always kind of would joke. I'm like, this movie's kind of 10% away from being what I would have called kind of like a perfect version of itself. Outside of remaking the movie from the ground up and reworking the script, if you're just going to take this movie as you have it in the editing room, what's kind of the best version? And I'm like, well, maybe a 10 minutes shorter, put in that Akira Takarada cameo that they cut that's apparently only like 30 seconds long, and then maybe 1 or 2 minutes more of Godzilla just to beef up some of these moments a little bit. You don't have to double his screen time or anything, but a 10-minute shorter movie and maybe a minute or two more of some hardcore Godzilla screen time, Godzilla fighting action. And that alone would just shift the balance and the percentages of the movie in this way where I think it would have worked a lot more for a lot more people, as opposed to some of the folks that complain of, oh, you don't see nearly enough Godzilla, oh, it's so slow, oh, it's dragged out, yada yada. It's kind of a 100-minute movie pretending to be a 2-hour movie is what I like to say. Like just a little leaner, and it kind of could have really worked without changing much else.
And as we look ahead to the Monsterverse continuing, I like to look back and, you look back at the opening weekend numbers for Godzilla 2014, and it came out just shy of 94 million domestic alone.
Yeah.
When you really think about that, that's insane when Godzilla Minus One only walked away with 100 million worldwide, which is a massive, massive achievement for that movie.
Yeah.
And then a movie like Dune Part 2, which is an absolute masterpiece. We called it a bona fide masterpiece. Opening up to,
82 million in North America.
And now I know a lot has happened.
And inflation's part of that, but I mean, that even more so, that 94, 93 million opening for Godzilla 2014, 10 years later, you're looking more at like 120 to 130 million, I think.
Yeah.
Ticket prices have inflated even more than the average dollar has in the last like 2-3 years specifically. So ticket prices are even more wild than they would have been. So a decade of ticket price inflation is quite a huge chunk.
Yeah, and I know it didn't have the legs it probably wanted, but again, no small feat. Very impressive, and they immediately greenlit the second one.
Yeah, and look at what they've built a 10-year, 5-film, and now a TV series franchise on the back of the success and popularity of this movie. And that says a lot. They got, films like Shin Godzilla and Godzilla Minus One and the anime trilogy, they're all, whether Toho would want to admit it or not, they're all very much a part of the legacy of this movie bringing Godzilla back into the mainstream. And so that's a lot to be, there's a lot to be said for that.
Yeah, it's probably my favorite cinematic universe.
Outside of the MCU, I would say, well, the MCU no longer. There was a point where the MCU, I would say, was my favorite cinematic universe. But now I think the Monsterverse, doing this sort of slow and steady, one film at a time thing, I think it is the best one going right now. What would you rate this film out of 10, sir, on a sort of scale of the Godzilla franchise, we'll say?
This is only my personal opinion. For me, I would give, if you asked me after the day after I saw it, 10 out of 10.
Absolutely.
My overall opinion has waned a little bit since then, but I would still, as a Godzilla fan, as a monster, creature feature fan, I would still give it a 9 out of 10.
Yeah, I'd want to say I'd maybe go 8.5. On again, if you're talking the scale of what is a masterpiece of a Godzilla movie and what is a bad example of a Godzilla movie, I would rate this somewhere in that sort of 8.5.
Yeah, and that's fine.
8.5-ish range.
If somebody came out and said no, this is only a 6 or a 7, I can. That's fine. I can totally see that. But if you only change a couple things about this movie, you can get close to a Godzilla -1 experience.
Very much so.
And to me, not only is that a 10 out of 10 Godzilla movie, that's a 10 out of 10 movie.
Yes.
So that's why my opinion is still very high of Godzilla 2014. And I'm okay being like one of the outliers with that opinion.
Yeah, and I don't have a negative opinion of it, like I said. And the impact that this film has on the sort of history of Godzilla is, it's sort of one of those debts that can't be paid. But, it's like the criticisms are there just to be criticisms. It's like, that's no lack of love for the movie. But it's like, yeah, it's maybe a few things that could have been tweaked, and who knows how much bigger and better it might have been. But it was still a very, very successful film. And
yeah, imagine if those things would have been on the original release, what kind of Monsterverse we'd have today.
Yeah, what if a G14 makes 600 or 700 million worldwide instead of 500 million? What kind of groundwork does that lay? What kind of ambitions does that throw into the fold?
But as you say quite often, there's a different flavor of Godzilla movie for everyone, and I'm still extremely happy about where we're at. And we're getting now these more Showa era like Godzilla movies with the Monsterverse.
Yeah, and not unlike the original Showa era, which went from very serious to much more outlandish. So too has the Monsterverse gone on a very similar arc. I always refer to it as the Neo Showa era because it's not only the sort of same kind of restart, but it's also the same kind of cinematic journey in terms of tone and style, which is very entertaining.
So that's pretty much going to wrap it up. Let us know what you think about it. We're probably going to rewatch all these now with the new one coming out soon, but let us know what you think.
Have a good one.